Hello and welcome to Disorganized Play. I love disorganized play. I love my desk. But I can sing. I cannot sing. It's sad. But I love my desk. And that's what matters. Now, here's Tom.
Oh, hello everyone. Welcome to Disorganized Play. I'm your dungeon master and host, Tom Lommel. Welcome to the show. I'd like to welcome Angelica.
Hi.
Creepy as all creepy can get. So that's the situation. Hey, I'm broadcasting not so much from the studio, as you may have noticed. Let's twist this a little bit. Let's see what happens. Yeah, whatever. All right. Dom has some things going on, so he was not able to make it to the studio today. So I'm broadcasting from my home here. So, welcome everyone. Thanks so much for joining me. We've got fairly languid. Friend computer is certainly one of the most fun computers. So we got a couple easy topics today on the list. I'll also take some time to do some Q&A, so we can talk about DM issues such as they may be, or game issues, or what have you. I'm open. Today's pretty low key. So we're going to talk about that's way up way up here. We're going to talk about the language game, not just necessarily like we've talked a lot about the language barrier in the game, but talking about the game that we played in order to get over the hump of the language barrier. I'm also going to talk about Angelica and I Love My Desk, the role-playing portion of the evening, the more extended role-playing portion of the evening, and then we're going to talk about Mech Mayhem, the combat, the fight with the robots. So, and then we'll do some Q&A. So I don't know that any of these will necessarily take super long, but I do like to address them in order. So whatever whatever questions you have, keep them on the back burner, but keep them in the back of your mind so that when we get to them, we'll get to them. But I'm going to try not to. I'm going to kind of knock these things off, and then we can have some Q&A if you are so inclined to do that. So, thanks everyone for joining me. Welcome aboard. I thought just by way of introduction, I thought it was a fun session last night. There were parts that worked better than others. As I think is the case with most sessions, you always have that thing that's like, oh, how's this going to go? And sometimes it goes better, and sometimes it goes a little clinkier than you expected. That's fine. Nothing tragic happened in terms of how things progressed last night. But I thought it was a fun. I thought it was a fun game. I thought we got a lot of information out there, and there were some interesting new revelations and twists and turns for the party. And I thought that was very successful that way in terms of, we talked on Tuesday about how the DM is the arbiter of information and information flow, and that's really your job, is revealing things to the players. And I thought we got a lot of interesting stuff out last night. So overall, I thought it was a great. I thought it was a great. I thought it was a great session. So. The language game. So that first portion that I want to talk about is the portion with the little see-through cards. If you are not familiar, I started off looking for cards or icons that I could download and then kind of flash either on my iPad or print up a bunch of cards and flash them forward and have them kind of name the things and whatnot. And then I realized that I had most of the good basics for that in a game called Imagine. So I don't know if let me see if I can Uh, let me see if I can find it. It is here. Yeah. I don't have the. I'm going to give you the Board Game Geek link since that's. Yeah, that's the one. All right. So I'll give you the Board Game Geek link here. You can use our Smile account if you want to get it too. So Imagine is actually a very interesting game. So the premise of the game is it's like charades. So you get a category and you get a specific thing within that category, and then you have to get everyone else to guess that without using words, without using gestures. It's the basics of charades. But instead of acting the stuff out in person yourself or with a partner, you act it out using the cards on the tabletop in front of you, right? So, yeah, I think you can kind of go to sleep. That's fine. I don't think we'll be hearing from Angelica again here today. But so the premise of the game is you have these cards with all these different symbols on them, and then you either manipulate them on the tabletop or you combine them to create a picture, or at least give enough of a clue as to what that thing is. You're trying to create a context that is accurate enough that people can guess. Now, people know what the categories might be: celebrity, it might be sport, you know, whatever it is, movie titles, and that sort of stuff. So that's Imagine. That's how it works. The premise that I had was, okay, so the challenge was, how do we get them to at least have some rudimentary communication back and forth, right? The idea was I didn't want to give just straight out, like, have the computer learn all of the language right off the bat. I felt like that was too much of a gimme. I wanted to give them the obstacle of, like, you have to figure out a way to get the computer to understand what you're doing, right? So the idea was the computer wants to talk to them, so it starts flashing up these symbols. You tell me what these words are, and then I know how to start using them. Now, I honestly, like, agonized over, like, what if, what could you assume would be a base strategy for a creature that probably has a completely alien language? And that just sends you down a rabbit hole that's almost impossible to address within the confines of a single game session. You could probably base an entire campaign over bridging that sort of understanding. I don't know that it would be particularly fun or interesting, but I don't know what this is all about. I'm really not inclined to click on it. I don't know if we have mods in the house who want to check that out. Please check that out, because that seems a little weird. Anyway, so I decided, well, you know what, we'll have them kind of indicate what these things are, and then we'll learn the language and we'll kind of get a conversation going using this limited vocabulary. That was the premise behind this particular encounter. Was that they could create a small vocabulary of words and then communicate back and forth with the computer. The AI would try to communicate with them using those words. I relied a lot. There were two problems with this premise, right? Number one, I relied on the players being more motivated and more ambitious about the task at hand. They didn't really understand, oh, okay, well, this is how we're going to be able to communicate with the computer, with this computer thing. They didn't understand why they wanted to communicate with it. Like, why would we want to talk to it? Which I think is a little, I don't know, like, it's funny how players kind of fall into that, right? Like, I'm not sure, maybe the computer makes an offering or something like that, but you as the player, you should want to get information as well. They were more apprehensive about it. Obviously, it's set up as a very apprehensive situation, right? So they're in this weird surgery room. There's dead doppelgangers. It looks like bad things are going to happen. None of the robots have necessarily shown that they're peaceful or friendly. They have every reason to suspect that the environment is has malicious intent, right? So I get that part of it. Like, why would we want to talk to this guy? Well, maybe we do, maybe we don't, but let's not work too hard at it. So part of it was just not clear enough setup of there's a payoff, there's some sort of reward for communicating with this thing beyond just it's going to talk to you and maybe try and talk you into something or whatever. They weren't strongly motivated to do that. The other issue is I didn't really set up the ground rules very clearly. It was just like symbols start showing up and they start naming things. And there's a point at which I just tell them, like, okay, because chat unlocked this, you can now teach it 5 words. The other piece of it that shaded my deployment of the thing was I had played Imagine before, right? I've played this game a few times, and the key to it is that the cards are all transparent. Let me get them. So So the cards are transparent, right? So if you wanted to, and we had it a little bit last night, right? Where Megan hit upon the idea, but almost like a little too late, where you have, this isn't going to show up very well. You have a man and you have water, and if you put the man in water, that's swimming. So you could do this, right? You could I'm really upside down here. Here we go. Maybe like this better. Swimming, right? That's the idea. Like you would get that. So the idea really was that you could combine these cards and interactively use them to describe activities. They missed out on the fact that until, well, I don't know, was it too late? It was like until late into this mini game that I had set up, or this puzzle that I had set up, they had missed out on the fact that they hadn't taught it any verbs other than go, right? So that like go and run were the two things that they had taught it. And so you can't really ask a question if you don't know is. They taught it yes, no. It didn't really understand their questions because they hadn't taught it enough words of the thing. And then they didn't really try to teach it any more words. So that was the game. I don't know that it was especially effective, right? Because the first part of it seemed way too simple and obvious. And there were some complicated concepts, like Gaurav tried to teach it Portal, and that's maybe where I fell down on the job. Is I should have had him make like an intelligence check or something like that to convey the idea. Oh, this is a portal. Like it's a good basic attempt, but it's not, because you're talking through the whole thing. It's like obviously I know that it's Portal, me personally, but does the computer understand? Well, I should have had him do an intelligence check, and then they could have combined the things to try and do a better to convey the idea. So I think if I were to go back and reskin or revisit this thing and revise it, what I would do is I'd have those symbols, boom, boom, boom. You name those, that's fine. And then for each card that they put together to convey the idea, I would probably go, okay, well that gives you, each card gives you a bonus. So if it's 2 cards, but it's very obviously swimming, I'm just going to give it to you. If it's a complex idea like Portal, but you use 4 or 5 cards, then I might give you on your bonus on your intelligence check to get it to convey, learn that concept, learn that idea. So that's what I would do to fix the game, because there really wasn't a game. The game was very easy. There's no challenge to it. Name these things. Sometimes they misnamed those things. So I made a list of the words that they had taught it, but then the next part of the game was too obtuse. They didn't understand how to play the rest of it or how to deploy a strategy to do it. And I think if they had played Imagine one time, they would have been like, oh, here, let's do this. Let's do a little charades thing. And they hadn't done that. And so that's where my assumptions and my experience diminished that particular encounter. Now, the good news is Gaurav decided to go for the cyber surgery and that happened, and then we could get directly to, okay, I can talk to you now. I still maybe am limited in that you don't know certain concepts. You don't know what necessarily a computer is. You may not know what a spaceship is, that sort of thing, right? But just checking in on there, just checking in and see if everything's cool. So you may not know what a spaceship is, you may not know what a computer is, so I still have to talk to you like I live in my desk. It's a kind of magic, but we could still communicate back and forth in a much fuller, richer type of experience. I do, I do, like I did hedge my bets, right? In that this AI Angelica can only talk to them in this room. She can't talk to them someplace else, and it's unknown whether the language learning that she's done has been transferred anyplace else, right? But I thought this portion of the evening was very successful in terms of it really got us into much more information about what's going on in this place, right? So we did like a hard deep dive on, okay, you are in a ship. Did they really get that it was a starship? No, but they didn't really ask those questions, which maybe it doesn't, maybe in character it wouldn't occur to them to ask those questions. But they understand that there was an accident, that there's God's fire everywhere, that Ava is somehow radiating God's fire. So I think it's pretty clear at this point, at least on a metagame level, that God's fire is radiation, right? So that was, I thought that was very valuable to have that. It got very silly at times, and I do think you say something and then you have to wait for me to type it out and then click send. Slowed the pace sometimes, or there's a point. I think there's a point at which I probably could have dispensed with it, but I like the weird kind of Siri/Alexa robot voice. Uh, I like thanks to whatever mod took care of that. I like the weird robot voice. It creates a level of abstraction that is a little bit slower. That does change the pace of the role playing interaction, but it puts such a distinctive personality on that thing. And also, we all kind of like know. Like, we've all wanted to play that game of like, let's have a conversation with Siri, or let's have a conversation with Alexa. Like, what if Alexa was actually like really smart, or what if we could interact with an entity like Janet from The Good Place or whatever, right? So I think it's a role playing opportunity that's worth exploring. I don't know that I would make it their longtime companion or something like that, but even though there were some pacing things, I thought it was a great interaction. It was surprising to me was it gave us just a whole new direction for the adventure. I was not actually expecting or planning for them to go to the central core of this deck, right? I thought the next thing that they would do would be to go to the Veggie Pygmies and check on Avril's parents. But part of it is she said, hey, you can help me fix the ship if you go take care of this thing, if you go take care of this information stream problem that we're having. And also, it's the classic thing of the newest quest is always the shiniest quest, right? So you can lay out these plot hooks and have them try to follow them, but when something new comes up, they're gonna be like, oh yeah, we should go take care of that. It's just very kind of attention deficit disorder, in not necessarily pejorative way. I don't mean that at all. But what I mean is, whatever comes up is first thing on their mind, and they tend to kind of shelve stuff that falls off. I think that's a classic problem with players. I don't even necessarily want to characterize it as a problem. I think that's a classic pattern for players. Is they play once a week. Unless one of their quests is like to save the world, they can't be dependent upon. Even then, they can't be dependent upon. Like, unless there's a ticking time bomb, literally like you have to go get this bomb out of your nasal cavity or your brain is going to explode, they will ignore whatever the current quest is in favor of, oh, there's somebody around that corner. There's a door over there that's locked. Let's go check that out. So, and that's fine. Like I get that. So I wasn't really anticipating that, but that's all right. It worked out. We got into the combat with the security robots, so let's move on to that next piece of the recap here. And those security robots are tough, right? They have this regenerating force field. The DCs are fairly challenging. Like, it's funny to me having come out of like third edition. Well, I've played basically every edition except first, right? I've played AD&D and third and fourth and fifth and da da da. But it's funny how we think of like DC 15 as something that players should be able to kind of like, well, that's a tough challenge, but it shouldn't be. It should be pretty cakewalk. And they really struggled with that. Like that's a tough DC to hit, and not everybody's going to get that. Okay, good night, Angelica. So having 25% of the party asleep at any given moment is really tough. That mechanism within the encounter, that encounter had some finicky twists to it, right? So it had grappling in it, and that's always weird because grappling really just turns into an action eater in my experience here at the table, right? Like as we've watched combat unfold and whatnot, grappling turns into the monster hits you, you're automatically grappled, you don't do anything until on your turn you break the grapple, and then if you want to move away and get an AOO you can, but otherwise then on the next turn the monster hits you and grapples you. So it doesn't do a lot of damage, it's action denial, and I don't know if that's particularly fruitful. Or it's fruitful if you want to like take somebody out of the fight and carry them away or whatever. I don't know. It's particularly interesting. I mean, like the character still does have the option to attack while they're grappled, so it's a little mix and match, but that's fine. I don't know. It's just not. Especially players of older editions have a really tough time going, he automatically grapples me? What, isn't there a grapple check? No, there's not. So it is what it is, and I would be careful how in how you deploy that particular tactic. In this case, it was coupled with this sleep gas grenade that functions like a sleep spell in that you have to take an action to wake the person up. Now, I was maybe a little too stingy on that. There could have been a few, like, there was the explosion, the loud bang. I gave him a saving throw to wake up to that. I don't know. In the context of this particular encounter, there were three big factors that sort of, like, tripled up on the players in terms of making this combat super difficult. One was, generally somebody was asleep. One member of the party was asleep. Two, generally one member of the party was grappled, which limited what their options were. And then three, they had the regenerating force field. And so if you're not pounding on that regenerating force field every round somebody has to take it out, right? So it regenerates, and there's ways around that, but they didn't key in on any of them. So those three things together made this an extremely tough encounter. I think on Tuesday when we get together and talk about what's coming up for this session, we need to reckon with the fact that the party has been very beat up. And are they going to turn around and go back to the Veggie Pygmies and take either a short rest or a long rest? Or are they going to go back to Angelica and take a long rest there? I feel like that potential is on the horizon. They may do something to try and essentially get back up to full speed because they were very, very beat up. Both Grayson and Ava took a lot of damage, and they only have 40-some hit points, right? So it's something to keep in mind. But I liked the fact that it was a tough fight, and I felt like it was paying homage to the original tradition of the adventure, which is you run into robots and they beat the crap out of you. They're extremely tough. And I like that idea too in terms of maybe the veggie pygmies aren't as tough, they just have numbers, and so you can deal with them kind of like you deal with goblins and kobolds, but maybe these robots are, you want to think twice before you get in a fight, another fight with the robots. Um, so that piece of it I thought was successful. It did go, the combat went a little bit longer than I thought. I did think when the second one showed up and they were really struggling, I thought, well, if you want to run away, you have to try and find a way to run away. In the end, they were so close to defeating it that I did play it out one round longer than I expected, but that's fine. It worked out. It was a great encounter. It was a tough, punch in the teeth for them. I think it was a valuable learning lesson of what they're potentially facing, and we'll see where they take that from there. I'm interested to get them into the central core. I think I want to do a little bit of design magic on that and figure out like, okay, well, what's that area like? Because right now it's really boring, and I don't know that they have the keys to get in there. Of course, the trick there is they don't need keys because they can just literally hack the door open. But maybe they as they start hacking the door open, wham, 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 here comes here come the security bots, and they're in trouble, right? So I don't know. We'll see where that goes. I think they learned a good. Hi everyone. Now I live in the middle of your screen. I think they learned a good lesson. There's an opportunity to see what their opposition was like. I learned a good lesson about how to deploy these things, how much I want to deploy these things. I think if they had been captured by them, they would have just taken them to the brig, and then maybe some other AI, interrogates them or contacts. The great thing is this eyeball thing that this cyber eye interface, or whatever you want to call it, this brain link, for lack of a better term, that Thawne now has, makes Thawne available as a character that the various AIs and robots and elements can talk to, right? And when I was looking at everybody's plot hooks and where they're involved and what's going on, Avril's got her parents. Grayson obviously is a doppelganger, which that invisibility thing is interesting and weird. And Ava's obviously got this God's Fire and Sacred Vessel thing going on, right? Where was Thawne? Where's his hook in this adventure? And I think now that he has dropped into, getting this cyber enhancement for whatever it's worth, I think there's some opportunities for him to kind of become a much more interesting, like have a much more central and vibrant part in the adventure, rather than just being the ride-along guy who's like, I used to have this cool sword, but now I have this thing, Dawn Razor, which is not as cool, but it's still pretty cool. But unless we're killing things, I don't really feel like I have a lot of purpose or function in the group, right? So yeah, thanks so much for everyone we had a great crowd yesterday, and we had some great tips, and I thought it was fun. I haven't been able to go back and watch much of the chat that took place during the night, but I definitely want to go back and see what people said in the moment as things were going on. So I'm going to talk for a couple minutes about kind of how I see things shaping up for Tuesday for our prep session. But if you have questions for Q&A, whether it's about your game, or whether you're playing it or running it, or you have questions about this game, I'm obviously not going to share all of my secrets. But if you have questions from last night or whatever, I'm happy to kind of address them to whatever extent I feel comfortable doing that. I want to have some things in my hip pocket for you all to be surprised at, but I'm happy to discuss some other things maybe that were going on that weren't clear, or if it's too much of a spoiler, I'll let you know. But if you have a question about, I don't understand this, or where do you think this is going, I'm happy to talk about it here. That's what the Q&A time is for. So whether we want to talk about your game, things that are happening in your issue, why don't you cue those things up in the chat now, and I'll just kind of parenthetically talk about where we go from here. So I think, as I mentioned, we need to consider where they're at with the rest. We need to consider that they're trying to go fix the neural network. And a lot of this stuff is stuff that I've layered into the adventure, right? Like these AIs don't exist in the original module. But I think that it's really worthwhile. Like the module for me has really opened up in terms of having these things that they can interact with. It's far more interesting, and there's far more capability to kind of like get your hooks into like, okay, here's the story and here's what's going on. Okay, we know that now. We know we need to go to engineering and we need to get a blue card in order to get down there. And where does that go? And oh, she can tell us if we can hook her back up with the rest of the information screen. She might be able to find one. That's great. Da 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 da. So so as much as the original module is a classic, I feel like the changes that have been implemented here really bring it into a whole new experience that is far more compelling and interesting than than what was on the page, like for a modern audience. For what it was at the time, for it's a tournament adventure, cool. Like it's got some fun twists and turns, and you're not expected to explore every nook and cranny. But for our purposes, with a modern group of players with more of a storytelling, character development type of bent, and especially for a streamed audience, I think this is where we're really finding we're starting to get into a sweet spot of information exchange, plot development, that sort of thing. So, yeah, I need to figure out, okay, what's the core look like? What's going on there? I think clearly there's two AIs, Sabina and Sebastian, who run the run the info stream. I didn't want to call it like the network, the net, the web. I didn't want to use those terms. So information stream is what I've settled on so far. Yeah, Thomas W. DeYoung points out long rest used to be a chat unlockable. Are there any plans to bring that back? Possibly. I always tweak chat just slightly, not slightly, but I tweak the chat unlocks. There's several of them that are sort of like fixed, and then there's some story element ones that you'll see come in and out. Like last night, there was one, if we had hit it, they would have found like a little cache of technological devices that they could use, etc. So I always do some customization around, well, this would help them out, etc. So maybe long rest will get put in there for next week. Here was the thing, like we would put it in as a goal, but then they might not use it, or we might not hit it, or they just might not be applicable, right? So the advantage to the rewards ladder that we have now, which is much more like wildcards, is when the time is opportune, we can make it as something that's an unlockable. But if we're going to have a long RP session where it just doesn't really get used and it just goes to waste, then I can take it back out, right? So I could see that as being something that might go in there. I am a little bit curious what else they might do or where they might go for a long rest. So I'm not sure. I'm not going to 100% say, yeah, we'll definitely do it, but I'm considering putting it on the docket for something that chat can kind of shortcut so we can keep adventuring further, right? Long rests always provide an opportunity for the players to go, hey, you know what? Let's not do that thing that we were just doing, and it's a long way back there. And you know what? Why don't we go find out where Avril's parents are? Like it is a thing within the game that it's a natural pause, it's a natural lull in the pacing, and players start to have ideas. Hey, since we're on a long rest, I'm going to see if I can start fixing that armor that I found. Or why don't we go to town and buy it? And that's where plans start to shift. And I don't know that there's anything necessarily wrong about that, but if you want to keep the pace building, you want to keep the group on goal and on target, then if you can find ways to sidestep the issue of taking a long rest, it helps keep the party focused, right? No, that helps your planning. So, That's where we're at. If you have other questions, we've got 20 minutes or so to tackle them. I know we had some new faces in the chat last night. That was nice. Nice to see new people. I appreciate everybody who's coming into the story. We are really just getting up to speed, I think, in the exploration of the barrier peaks. Where they've been in the ship, I guess, of 3 episodes now or so. We had a lot of travel leading up. But I think the other piece of that is, because we're doing more of a theater of the mind style exploration rather than marching around on the grid, it's much easier to edit stuff in and edit stuff out, right? So I edited out the encounter of the doppelgangers around the turbo lift. In fact, I didn't even see that turbo lift. But that's fine. We had the encounter in the med lab, which I thought was far more developed and interesting than what was necessarily on the page in the adventure. So on the one hand, like, it took us a long time to get into the ship, but I can selectively edit and advance the plot in response to what they're doing, and kind of clip things together so that they move a little bit faster, right? So that's one advantage to just getting off of the grid and describing areas in more abstract terms versus getting down and dirty into, okay, now there's a corridor to the left and to your right. And it's like, if you need a place to hide, great, there's a place to hide. So that's, I do like having combats on the grid, but for specific instances, for specific set piece type of encounters. So, barring further questions, I guess I'll just reflect a little bit on some of the highlights of things that got revealed that I thought were valuable. And also there was a couple things that kind of got dropped, right? It's interesting to note that they've forgotten about the owl that they have in their backpack. It looks like Ava has probably forgotten about the grav belt that she found. Is there anything else in particular? No, there's not. Those are 2 biggies to me. Well, and then they've sort of dropped the thread of following Avril's parents, right? Which was surprising to me, because that's where I thought the session was going to go. I thought we would leave that room and then go try and do a foray against Avril's parents. I'm not disappointed that didn't happen, but I myself was surprised that they were like, okay, we go find those 2 people. It's in this area, great, we go there. On the other hand, like, it is a definitive place to go, a definitive thing to do. They had a map, and it didn't sound like it was going to be as involved as going and fighting a bunch of Age of Pygmies. So that's something that I understand in hindsight, right? But in the moment, I was like, okay, well, let's see what happens here. But the combat ate up most of the time, so that I have more time to prep something more detailed than what I would have run just off the top of my head last night. M_SC does have a question, so let's address that here while we're at it. As a new DM for D&D, and 5 sessions in, I feel like I don't know enough lore about Faerun and other things. If I knew it, I don't know how to convey that to the players. Do you have any advice in that regard? I started reading the Drizzt books, but I feel like that is going to be quite a slow progress. No problem. Yeah, I have this same issue myself, right? In that there is literally an overwhelming amount of information about the Forgotten Realms available to you. And I'm not one of those I'm not one of those guys who grew up just like steeped in like, oh yeah, this is the history of Greyhawk and this is canonical and here's what happened and then this war, da 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 da. And I didn't necessarily read all of the novels to keep up on how the fiction side of the business influenced the canonical side of the the game part of the business, right? And moreover, I never really, back in the day, I never participated in Living Greyhawk or Living Forgotten Realms, where it was important to keep up with the events. And I was aware of things like the Time of Troubles when they switched editions and that sort of stuff, right? And there were these major, like, deities died and then they came back, and then some of them were murdered and not murdered, and one of the unmurdered ones came back, etc. Like, there's an incredible amount of material to absorb. And I don't think you should put that burden on yourself to try to be a master of it all, right? That's not, that's a big time investment. And especially if you're just starting out as a DM, your time is better served reading and understanding the module and knowing where you can take shortcuts and what's coming up soon and maybe what you want to skip because it's getting too involved or the players aren't really interested in this hook, so you can let that fall by the wayside. So like studying the adventure, and then secondarily, like, let's say number one is studying the adventure as a new DM. Number two is studying your players and seeing what they're interested in on two levels. One on a story level, right? Oh, they're really interested in saving this guy who's been kidnapped. Let's find that guy. But also in a game level, because I'm guessing a lot of your players are new too, right? So do they like the mystery investigation part of it, or do they like the role playing part of it, where we get to do funny voices and talk to people and develop our characters, or do they just like the combat part of it, or are they like intrigued by the magic items, right? So those things, like, understand what twists the little like pleasure knob in your players' brains, and it's going to be different from person to person. So those three things are what I'd start with, and the fourth thing I would study as a DM is, what are the rules that I get hung up on? What are things that came up during the session that I didn't know how to adjudicate? And it really bogged everything down. We had to like slog through 170 pages of the rule book in order to figure out like, oh, here's where we, and like, if you're having a moment where you're like, I'm having a really hard time finding X and such, the index in the player's handbook is somewhat of a travesty, in my opinion. I don't want, I don't want cover to say see obscurement, and then obscurement it says see, making an arranged attack, and under making arranged attack it finally says page 181, right? Like, in the first place, like, don't send me down that rabbit hole. Just tell me it's on page 181 when I ask for it. And that's one of the things I really struggle with the player's handbook is like, thank God there's so many electronic resources for you to look up rules, because finding your way through that index is a nightmare. So those are things that I would focus on, right? I would try and master the plot and the plot hooks of the adventure and understand what the encounters are like. I'd really try to understand what my players are like. And then finally I would try and like gain mastery over the rules that are tripping me up or I don't understand, or just gain mastery of the rules as much as I can in general, right? Those things are important. Now, so as I've indicated, your area of focus, how do I portray the world appropriately, that's fifth on the list for sure, right? And here's the reason for that, is it's your world. There's a lot of, there's a lot of homage paid to, oh, this is directly from the mind of Ed Greenwood, and Chris Perkins wrote this thing, and we really idolize lore in this game, and I get it, right? Like, that's how you build these grand epic stories, is out of the details, right? And why not pull directly from the talented minds of Chris Perkins and Ed Greenwood if you want to create a world filled with very specific, intriguing, engaging details? Why make that work for yourself? Sure, But you don't have to break your neck trying to get every single one, because I guarantee you that your players, if you're not planning to send them to Chult, sometime in the very near future, don't worry about knowing what Chult is all about and what's going on and all that, what's going on in the current storyline. I think one of the side effects of having sort of this barnstorm, this take the beach kind of approach to streaming lately that Wizards has embarked upon is everybody's running the same adventure because it's the newest and greatest thing, and that makes everybody feel like, oh, I got to keep up with what's going on in the chronology and what's cool and what's interesting and the truth is, it's going to take you the better part of, depending upon how often you play, just to play the starter set might take you 3 or 4 months. If you look back at, let's take for example the Adventure Zone, right? The Adventure Zone started with the starter set. They played 5 or 6 sessions, and Griffin was like, yeah, and then some other stuff happens, and you get to the end of it, and it's fine. And it's, like he skipped massive portions of the whole thing, right? Because he wanted to get on to his story. And my point is, it's your story right out of the gate. You do not have to. If you were to play the starter set end to end, it would take you 3 or 4 months. So as Solo Echo points out, you don't have to follow it verbatim if you don't want to. Feel free to edit things down. Feel free to add new areas that you think might be interesting, right? Like, it is an opportunity to learn how the pieces work together and to give a variety of encounters and kind of string along a plot line and a storyline that develops in an interesting way. So yes, but also it's your world. So my basic point, I know that sounds trite. I want it to be helpful. So let me tell you what my approach is. We went to Waterdeep. There's not a ton of great resources on Waterdeep right now, right? There's 4 pages in the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide. What else is there, right? Not a lot. Not a lot. So what I did was I took a book about Waterdeep that was printed off in 2nd edition, and I knew it wasn't current. I knew it was not necessarily, like, the canon may have changed, and these people who are ruling are different people. But I read the pieces that I wanted to read, and I fit it into my story, because my campaign is my campaign. And your players, unless they really are rabid readers of the fiction, who really want, like there's that type of player who really wants, like, everything to be, in context and make sense with the whole continuity of what's been outlined in the canon. And technically during the spell plague, blah blah blah. Myth Draenor is really like this, blah blah blah, right? Unless you have that type of player who has more knowledge than you do, which is probably not the case, then it's your world, and you put in whatever pieces you think are interesting, and you change whatever you think is interesting. So rather than trying to read all this stuff and make sure that you regurgitate it appropriately and oh, that's right, this guy is actually the head, this duke is actually in charge of these people who run this church, get yourself a list of NPC names and get yourself a notebook that you have open during the session, and as you fabricate lore or extend lore based on, oh, I don't quite remember this right, but I'm not going to stop and look it up. Don't stop and look it up. Remember it however it, remember it for whatever it is at that moment as it occurs to you. Write down what you told them, and that's the canon. That's the world. It's not a matter of cut yourself loose and just make up whatever you want, and then all of a sudden you've got all this improv pressure of like, yeah, and this place is ruled by a group of nuns who all worship a demon god who carries a double-headed mace. instead of putting that kind of open-ended pressure on yourself to improvise, use the material as you remember it for inspiration. But then, as you create those things, just write down a little, like, oh, okay, the dwarves are. This is a dwarven society. Dwarves are in charge. You'd be surprised how you can start with a hint of a detail, and the party will like take that at face value and be happy with it. And it won't be until sessions later that you actually have to develop it, right? So don't necessarily. There's a middle path, right? There's one end of the spectrum. Oh, over here. On this end of the spectrum, you have I'm making everything up. I don't use any background material. I just make it. I improvise the whole thing on the fly. And on this end of the spectrum is I adhere rigidly to canon and what's written, and I only go by what what the true path that's been laid forward in the printed and published materials. And I'm saying split the difference, right? Give yourself the freedom to improvise around the details that you remember. If you have some time to read about an area that's interesting, that's maybe coming up, great. Give yourself that piece of information. Load up the inspiration hopper with those specifics. Like, steal from the greats when you can, but don't worry about aping the greats to every little dotted I and crossed T. So, I hope that helps. Let me know if let me know if you feel like that advice is helpful. I will say, just by way of disclosure, I'm terrible about writing notes down during the session. So I definitely feel your pain where you're like, oh, well, let's see, what did I say? Now, the good thing is I record my games so I can go back and watch them if I want, but I still have 4 hours worth of material that I have to kind of like get through in order to like. I remember sometimes I will have named an NPC and I want to have them come back and I'll be like, what episode was that? And then at what point did they talk to that person about that thing? And it really gets to be a drag. So I will cop to the fact that I'm not good myself about keeping notes as I go. I'm getting better about it, but I think it's if that seems intimidating, like, understand it's a hard thing to do when you're trying to keep the pace of the story going at the table. So, all right. Let me know if you have a further detail on that. But we are at Q&A, Mr. BSB Care. Solo Echo says, I end up mashing modules together or making one thing in the mod that says this amulet's useless and make that a holy curse item or something, and it leads into Strahd if you want. Yeah. If you go back and watch, you'll see, if you watch on Tuesday, you'll see me like take things that aren't very well defined and start developing them into useful concepts and themes or major clues in the adventure, and I may not have known that at the time, right? Trying to think of a good example of that right now is going to be, they have found a device called an owl, which looks a lot like this Bluetooth speaker, right? And very deliberately so, because as we saw last night, I can put it on the table and I can make it play noises, and it's like a nice in-game prop, right? They have a thing called an owl. I can kind of pop that thing up at any time and have it fulfill a useful function in the storyline. So I'm a fan of introducing things that are a little bit undefined and then defining them further as they become germane to the plot, right? Or as parts of the plot need to be revealed. Let's put it that way. It's funny. I make what I call Schrodinger's clues. I make the things that I introduce into the game that are, I'm not sure what this does. I'm not, I'm going to put that in my backpack for now. And I make them fit into the needs of the plot rather than making the plot revolve around, well, this is a magic item that does X, Y, and Z. All right. BSB Care says, in general, I am a big fan of mashing modules together. Just one final point here on what Solo Echo has pointed out. But I think you do need to be careful of the fact that players have that kind of like short-term vision. They don't necessarily remember things more than 2 sessions back. Like once you get to 3 sessions back, things start to become fuzzy. They tend to forget about items that they've accrued or whatever. Um, and they can't really see the plot more than 1 or 2 sessions ahead of them, even though you may be trying to plan that far away. That sort of mashup of like, well, this amulet that wasn't supposed to do anything has something to do with Curse of Strahd. You may be planning this great reveal where months down the road, oh, it turns out you have the perfect thing. Well, if the players have forgotten about it, then they feel kind of like ripped off. Like they feel kind of, it makes them feel stupid, right? Because you're like, they're frustrated. Like, why don't we know how to kill this weird revenant that keeps coming after us? And you as the DM is like, well, why don't you make an intelligence check? And then they make an intelligence check, and then you go, you remember you have this amulet? And they're like, oh, okay. There's nothing satisfying about it, right? They haven't solved the puzzle. You've just sort of slapped them in the face with how stupid they are or how they've forgotten something. So it's nice to like present that as, you know, your adventure winds down, and then you are visited by a man who's like, I understand you've come into possession of this strange amulet. Oh, yeah, I guess we did. Well, I have some information, and I might be willing to buy it from you. Oh, well, I'm not selling it. Forget that. What do you think it does? Well, I think it does this, but okay, well, we're not selling it. Did you see how that approach is much better than if you kind of like pinch them in a corner of like, you're relying on them to remember that they have this thing in order to unlock the secret to an encounter. That's my thought on that. All right. Yes, I am treating God's fire similar to radiation, BSB care. That's true. Yeah, I did drop that bit that Torm had left the ship, and I think there's more going on there than they have thought about. But you know, here's the thing. I thought that was going to be a huge reveal, right? I thought they were going to have a real like moment of like, oh shit, what Torm has left the ship. But because it was presented in this weird kind of like, Alexa's telling you Torm has left the ship. In the context of what was going on in that situation, it became a much more lighthearted and kind of like, oh yeah, we knew that, kind of easily dismissed point. So I think there's more plot to be explored there with that. But the way it was presented did not make a huge hit on their impression. I would say that is essentially sort of like either a distant, maybe even a dormant plot hook of like not being connected to Torm. I don't think it's entirely going to go away and go dormant, but it's not causing a problem for them really in any major way. Grayson can still smite and get his spells and things like that, but it's not as important as I thought it was going to be. And that's fine. You know, one of the other keys to DMing is giving up on, oh, this is going to be a really great moment, and then when it doesn't turn out the way that you think, getting kind of like mad or frustrated about it, right? Like, no, okay, fine, now I need to find a different approach. Bcon H29 says, how long does it take for you to write the storyline for each episode? I'm going to be honest, like, I struggle with prepping these sessions, right? I have ideas about what the big story here is, and I think, you know, it's the greatest strength, greatest weakness type of situation, where I have ideas about what is the quote-unquote big climactic problem that the party is facing, what's going on in this situation that is their save the world driver, right? And ostensibly the quest that they've been set on is to find and capture the God's Fire. But I think as we started to see surface last night, the God's Fire is misunderstood by people outside of the ship. And so there's something else that they've got to do. There's maybe something bigger or more interesting going on. And I have ideas about what that is, but as they start chasing down different leads, then I start adjusting that plan to kind of fit the story that they're following rather than making them follow the story that I want to lay out. So I don't sit down and write like, okay, here's the plot and here's the things that they need to unlock. I reflect and I have ideas about what would be interesting to explore, and then depending upon how the players react to it, I adjust it to whether it actually is interesting in play to this group of players to actually like engage with and explore, right? So I'm not one of those people that I don't spend, hours plotting out the adventure ahead of time, and I don't spend hours plotting out I don't know. I struggle with it because it's so improvisational and flexible. Like because I'm an improvisational jazz DM, as one of my friends from high school said, uh, it's. I do feel a little overwhelmed when Wednesday gets here, and it's like, okay, even though we've had a prep show and I've talked about what I want to do, there is just the physical work involved in putting the things together that I want to have put together, right? So let me just walk you through prep time yesterday, just to give you a concrete example of how things went down. I think I started prepping around 3 o'clock, which was 2 hours later than I wanted to. And I knew that I wanted to have this AI make contact and I wanted to breach the language barrier, but I didn't want it to be just a giveaway. I wanted it to be some sort of puzzle or exercise, some sort of obstacle for them to work their way through. And I had an idea that I want to do something about showing symbols and teaching the thing a language. And maybe like using my iPad to swipe through those photos or printing off some pieces of paper that would have shown them different things and they go, that's a hand, that's a bird, that's a tree. But I spent probably 2 hours struggling with this before I realized I had those cards. And then I started dividing the cards up. And so I spent 2.5 hours maybe on getting that first puzzle scenario with the language cards together. So that brings me to 5:30, maybe even 6 o'clock, right? Now, I generally figure we're going to have about 3 encounters a night. That's about, by the time we get the recap up and going, get everybody introduced and everything going, that's half an hour of the show. And then the first encounter takes an hour, the second encounter takes an hour, and the third encounter takes an hour. That's generally the way things are played out. So I started thinking about, okay, well, where are they going to go after they talk to this AI? I thought they were going to talk to the Vegapygmies. I'm like, well, we should have some. They may encounter robots. I have stats for Vegapygmies. By the time 6 o'clock rolls around, I'm starting to get into panic mode, right? In terms of, okay, well, what else do I need prepped, right? So between 5:30 and 7 o'clock, it turned into, do I have stats for the monsters that they may potentially encounter? Yes. The big thing that I ended up doing at 5:30 is I sat down and I started making a list of all of the AIs that are in the ship. What are the various systems that they would be in charge of, and what are each of those names, and then where does that kind of take me? In the process of doing that, I have ideas, right? And then I started making a list of, okay, well, if they're going to encounter Vegapygmies, let's give these guys some definitive names, because I don't want them to be called Chief Mudbutt, right? So the most profitable thing that I did last night for myself in order to prep the situation was simply make a list of the different departments within the ship, or if you want to call them positions within the ship. So there's there's the neural networking thing. Sabina and Sebastian are the two AIs who are in charge of basically like IT systems, right? There's the med lab, there's bioengineering, there's terraforming, there's a central command AI that's in charge of coordinating everything on the ship, there's an engineering AI, like making that list of what the different departments were and then just naming who was in charge of them and leaving blank space on that page for me to fill in then as I went along. Okay, if we meet this guy, I'm going to make some decisions on the fly, what he's like, what his personality like, what her personality is like, and I'm going to leave myself space on my page to write notes next to each of them about what that interaction was like, what their attitude was like, and what they knew and what they gave away, right? That helped inform like, okay, here's what's going on in the ship, and who gave me some places to attack the role playing portion of the evening. So that was a big help for me. Then I started looking for stats, and I also started looking at, okay, if they find some pieces of technology, do I have the tech tree game in a polished enough form that we could run it at least on a rudimentary basis? It's basically its own little mini game, and I'm going to do a brush up on it so that it's more presentable, and maybe we'll talk about that on Tuesday if I have it ready then. But that was another thing that I chased down, and then I spend a good half hour, 45 minutes making sure that what's in the rewards sheet makes sense because I tailor that every time. So my prep time, the short version of your question is like 4.5 hours plus a half hour in the car driving and thinking about the game, and then whatever we've talked about earlier in the week. These chats back and forth help give me ideas, bubble up possibilities, little bits of inspiration, so that it's not just all crammed into that particular 3 hours. But part of it is I'm a little OCD and I tend to procrastinate and then I get under the gun and I start to panic. So it's all very compressed. I don't know if that's useful information to you, other than the fact that I'm happy to admit that I struggle with prep and I struggle with feeling overwhelmed or at least intimidated by, well, what's going to happen tonight? What's going to be interesting? What can we do that'll be a fun experience for the players? It'll be a fun experience for the audience. Like there's pressure there that I think we all feel as GMs. So even though I have my, name on the screen and I don't even have my name on the screen, but even though I'm the one hosting the show, right? I still also struggle with that kind of feeling of anxiety of how am I going to pull this thing together. So I have paused my comments, so let me catch up here a little bit, right? So that's I don't know. That's where I'm at with. I feel like I could do a better job of prep. I think when we start to go forward and start looking at this query obstacle reward methodology, I didn't use it extensively last night, but I already had a list of things from Plot Radar of stuff that I wanted to reveal. I wanted to hint that the radiation was God's fire, that sort of stuff. The advantage to doing either Plot Radar or this query obstacle reward system, and I think maybe I'm going to call it query obstacle reveal because that feels more in tune with what the point of the exercise is. But the great thing about having a bunch of stuff that you want to reveal is then when you get into that role-playing session, it gives you a lot of meat to either like little bits out there of this and that, or drop some full-on like truth bombs of like, here's what's going on, here's what these people are. I would like to, can you find me a doppelganger? I've been looking for doppelgangers. Like, I don't think there are any left on the ship. I need one because I want to dissect it and then make a bunch more doppelgangers. So yeah, I don't write out huge pieces of the story ahead of time. I don't sit down and write down, here's what's going to happen tonight. I do think about what secrets am I keeping that the party would like to know, that would help them understand what's going on, that would give them an advantage, or that would allow them to see a weakness or achieve understanding about how to move the plot forward. All right, so. MSC says, I was thinking if I know all the lore, I can be consistent and don't have to remember all the times I strayed from the path of canon. That's true. I mean, here's the thing. You also don't necessarily have to cover a huge piece of the world, right? If you want to, the starter set is set in a fairly finite locale. You could define a lot of that or read about that area and then not have to worry about, what's going on in Neverwinter or what it's like in Waterdeep, etc. Like, you can pull those details in as the opportunities present themselves. So then if you read something about Neverwinter, you can have an NPC show up who's a trader from Neverwinter, trader as in trade goods, and then you've already prepped a little bit of like, oh yeah, no, this is what it's like. Now that may lead to the party going, well, I want to go there. In which case, now you're shifting focus away from the locale that you've studied up on. But the nice thing about the starter set is it's a fairly small, self-contained area with a lot of interesting hooks. You can provide your own embellishments if you want, but it's not a lot of reason to get mastery of that area, right? You only need to know the big strokes about stuff. You don't need to know everything that the Lord's Alliance is up to. Who gives a crap? The other thing that I might suggest is, if you can break away, go play some Adventurers Guild, Adventurers League games at your game store or whatever. And those are always kind of steeped in interesting bits of politics and plotting and, meta plot and that sort of stuff. And I relentlessly steal from that world building stuff. Oh yeah, there was recently a big thing going on with the Giants. How's that? I don't necessarily need to get into the details, but I absorb it by playing it. Where is D20 Robot today? I don't know. All right. Yeah, it would be great if we had a wiki on Iron Keep. We're getting pretty deep into it, so I don't know that that's going to work. MSC, just to continue this thread a little bit, sorry. We follow the starter set really verbatim to learn D&D together, and I felt like I just dropped my players into a foreign land, but their characters have some history, which I could only explain half-heartedly. So far, everyone enjoys playing, and I'm getting more comfortable with funny voices role-playing. I just felt like sometimes a bit more background would help to put more meaning into the player's actions. So I'm going to make one other suggestion here, which is you're perfectly entitled to freeze your game right now and do a one-shot that's like your party as a group of teenagers or before they're actual adventurers, right? And just like give them really stripped down character sheets that don't have a lot of different things to do, and then put them in a weird situation and say, we're playing a flashback episode. We're going to play the day that you all decided to leave your hometown, or the day that you all were indoctrinated into the town guard, or the day that you rescued the town from the fire, the monster, whatever the threat was, right? And play it as a flashback and have them play. I've used this successfully several times. Have them play the teenage version of their characters and go back and have them be big and over the top with like all of the teenage drama and goofiness that happens when you're teenagers, and ineptitude. Embrace the ineptitude and consider playing something that's not D&D to do it, but you can stick with D&D, that's fine. But that may go back and make them feel like, okay, now I understand, like, we care about this farmer because when I was a kid I had a crush on his whatever, son, daughter, what have you, right? Or I care about him because I feel really bad that I set his barn on fire or something like that. So if you go back and just play a single flashback episode and then just jump right back into the campaign wherever you left off, that may make your characters, your players feel more integrated with the setting than just like, okay, well, today you have decided to take up, sword and shield and go off and find your fortune, which feels like a very disconnected, abrupt start. So that's another trick. You're allowed to screw with the timeline. Go back and play. And obviously they know, okay, well, when we're teenagers, we didn't get killed, but maybe now you discover, oh, one of them does have like a scar on their back from that time when they were teenagers and they fought off the displacer beast and it ripped into them, or etc. BSB Care says, I want to see you bring that scroll case from the first module back. Ooh, oh, that's never going to happen. All right, so, yes, Bear Peaks Crash Spaceship. Just catching up with the comments here, I'm sorry. All right. Solo Echo asks, when you struggle with the story, is it that more so because your players want maps and tangent things to look at, or do you enjoy theater of the mind? I find often enough the story is never the problem. It's the presentation that snags a GM's plan. Well, this adventure is very heavy on handouts, right? So let's just acknowledge that up front, that this adventure, one of the charms of it is that it has 60 illustrations that come in its own separate booklet, and you put that goofy picture out in front of them, and then I go, okay, all right, that guy with the syringe thing, all right, yeah, I punch him in the face. He's just a robot. I don't care about him. I stay away from that weird thing. No, I'm not interested. There's a wonderful charm to that. So you do have to kind of craft your story around. Or I feel like it's important to craft this particular story around the handouts that are available to me, right? I also want to add in some of my own and whatnot. So I do feel a certain pressure of like, I want to have this mini game that basically replicates the tech tree, but I want it to be interesting and fun and fairly, engaging. But that means I have to put a certain amount of time and effort into brushing up the presentation, making sure the design at least functions on a certain level, and kind of getting there, right? Like doing that work that's going to take me 3 hours to do. I struggle with the story for the same reason I think a lot of people struggle with like improv, is that you're afraid of revealing too much. What if I tell them this, then what are they going to ask about next, or how do they get there next? And I'm not sure I have the answer to that. So I tend to be hesitant around crafting the story because I'm afraid of giving away too much, right? And I think that's a very common DM fear, issue. So I think that's something that DMs regularly struggle with. And I would say, like, my best advice is just to embrace it. You're going to create more mystery. You're going to create more details that then take them to another place. And even if they kill the guy who's supposed to be your big bad guy on page 1, that's okay. Turns out he was just being manipulated by the intellect devourer or the mind flayer or whatever, who ends up being the big bad on page 10 or session 10 or whatever it is, right? I enjoy Theater of the Mind for this because it's very convenient, and also I can give descriptions of the epic scale of the place and make it feel a lot bigger than it actually is. Did you see last night when I put the map down? They were like, oh, well, we're like right on top of this thing. And I'm like, well, you're probably more at this corridor. Like, the ship suddenly got really small when I put that map down. And I had to kind of hedge my bets there a little bit and say, well, it's not really to scale. It's not exactly like it really, to me, I feel like in hindsight, it diminished the scope of what they were adventuring through once we got that map up. But players want to follow a map. A map is a great way to focus and channel the player's attention, right? You are here. Here there be dragons, treasure, right? So it's that it's that aspect that, like, that's what makes maps such a valuable tool. So I think maps, if you want to talk about like a battle map versus theater of the mind, if you're continually drawing a battle map, and I've done that plenty of times in my career as a DM, is like, let's draw our way through the dungeon, etch, 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 and put down a new tile or unroll some more, and then it goes this way, and then there's this room here, and there's something very viscerally appealing about moving those miniatures around and like seeing like what the shape of the room is, and now I know I'm exactly in this spot and this guy's over here and I attack him and da 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 da, right? But it also does lead you into kind of an ants marching type of mentality of, now you're in this room. Here are the two exits to this room. We will now explore this, go this way. Oh, we left a door behind. You know, it gets players kind of sucked onto the map, and sometimes that attention gets a little sticky. And I don't think that you got to find a blend of the two. I like maps for big set piece combats where it's really like the details matter and you can show here's the array of forces. It's funny because describing the ship using theater of the mind makes it seem a lot bigger and a lot more intimidating than it is if you were to draw it on the page. But if you were to draw a room that had an altar and some pillars and a choir loft or whatever, and said there's 20 there's 20 goblins and 2 cultists in this room, and then you put those miniatures on the map, the players feel like all of a sudden, wow, that's a lot of enemies to fight. Like the combat takes on a lot higher drama than if you were to just say, there's a large room, there's a choir loft, there's an altar, there's 2 cultists and 20 goblins. It'd be like, how many goblins? 20? Yeah, we can take that. So it's almost the inverse, right? When you get into those very grindy kind of specific combat moments, I think being on the map can really help you a lot. Help convey the drama of the situation to the players. Conversely, when you're just exploring, you have a lot more freedom to freelance things when you're in theater of the mind. That's what I had to say about that. Yeah, that German translation software, that's just a German voice that I downloaded onto my iPad. Honestly, the whole thing was free, and I'm really surprised at how well all of it worked together to give the AI distinct voices and to give it a personality. And my investment was I had to bring my Bluetooth speaker, my keyboard, and my iPad along to the game, which I'm bringing my iPad anyhow. So that was fun. So yeah, I was happy with how that played out and how it really required basically no investment on my part other than learning the software and making sure the voices were installed on my iPad. So I was very happy with how that worked out. I'm generally a fan of lists and tables and charts, as long as you understand, as long as they have a purpose attached to them. And I'm definitely a big fan of leaving blanks. The leave blanks principle from Dungeon World. How far behind Chad am I? Quite a ways. I'm gonna buzz through this. I'm not gonna tackle every single point. We're going a little long today, but that's fine. So. Yeah, just MSC. I would second your gut feeling here, which is make up what you need to make up for now, and don't worry about whether it's going to feed into the next adventure appropriately or not. Because 2 things. 1, your players will probably have forgotten about it by the time you get to the next adventure, whatever detail that was. And 2, even if they didn't, you have plenty of opportunity before you start that next adventure or during the course of that next adventure to explain why the way you said it the first time is actually the way that it is, or has changed in the intervening interval, right? In the intervening time span. So if I say, all red wizards, and the red wizards are a benevolent order of mages who go around and do good deeds for everyone in the duchy. And then you find out, oh shit, the red wizards are actually horrible necromancers who are trying to raise a dead god and steal its power to wreak vengeance upon the world. And there's this horrid, malevolent force. Well, guess what? It doesn't take too much work to go, oh, it turns out the Red Wizards were working some sort of psychological operation in this particular area and trying to ingratiate themselves with the local duke so that they could find the MacGuffin that's buried in the top of Quest of Doom Hill and retrieve the artifact that they needed to help them on their nefarious quest. It turns out they were just putting on airs, and locally everybody thinks of them as really nice, but it turns out everybody else knows they're a-holes. So you'll find a way to justify it. If the players, assuming the players, let's assume number one that the players forget about it, but if they don't, you can find a way to make it fit and make it justified. It's also okay to say, hey, you know, it turns out I was a little bit wrong about this. Let's retcon this. You can have that conversation with your players too. What are they going to do? Revolt? If they mutiny, guess what? One of them has to DM, and now it's their problem. You get to play. All right, so dun, dun, dun. Yeah, most of the background information is quickly forgotten by the players anyway. Yeah. All right. I will say that having a notebook beside you is just having it open and not worrying about organizing it or anything like that. Just writing notes is a habit that I myself am trying to get into. And Ivalon gives great advice here that when the players are debating things or they're having a conversation that you're not necessarily immediately involved in, that's a great time to just make a couple notes for yourself. You'll often see me either making notes or thinking about what's going to happen next when the players are having an RP moment of like, oh, Grayson, why are you lying to us all the time? No, I'm really an honorable guy. So, some great links there from BSB Care. Thank you. All right, so good advice on here on maps and grids and whatnot. It's all good. You know, we have Q&A time carved out today, so that if you have questions about running your game, you know, we can share our collective knowledge. So I think that's all important. And yes, as Ivalon points out, you can also say, in my realms, the Red Wizards are different. They are your realms, right? That's the thing. Like, that's ultimately what it comes back to is I was intimidated by running Waterdeep because it's such a huge, dynamic, engaging locale, and there's so much lore about it. And there's so many stories set there, and there's so many ginormous adventures there. You know, the Yawning Portal is this like iconic bar that people go to, and then they go delving in Undermountain and what that's like. Blah blah blah. Your players don't know any of that. So introduce the pieces that you want to introduce, tailor the pieces that you want to tailor, make people fulfill the function that serves your game. Make the lore serve your game. Don't make your game serve the lore. That's the best piece of advice that I can give you. Because ultimately your players, they either like really get into it, which is great. They forget about it, doesn't matter. Or they're focused on something else. You know? They don't care that, you know, they don't care that whether the archmage is Kelvin Blackstaff or somebody else. They don't care. It doesn't matter to them. They need to know that there's a powerful magister who is the archmage of the town, who is basically a 20th level caster, who can do whatever world-bending things you want a wizard to do. And whether that's Kelvin Blackstaff or he's been murdered canonically, no longer is around, like, they don't care. So don't worry about obeying the canon. You can always come up with an excuse. Bend the canon to serve your purposes and do things that are appealing to your players. So that is my advice to you. I hope you're having fun with with the starter set, and I hope this is the springboard to much more interesting adventures. I will tell you, as a final kind of unsolicited piece of advice, that the hardback adventures are enormous. They're however 160 some pages, or oftentimes 220 some pages, or whatever. There's a lot of material there. They go off kind of, they have chapters that just go off and meander kind of all over the place and are designed to help the party see the world a little bit as kind of like a travelogue. Just depends upon what the adventure is. They take a lot of work and they take a lot of time to play. And so don't feel like you're going to run more than one of them. My suggestion is, when you finish the starter set, pick an adventure that you're interested in, whether it's Storm King's Thunder, maybe Curse of Strahd. Honestly, like for a new group, I wouldn't go from the starter set to Curse of Strahd unless you have people who are really into like vampire style stories and gothic horror style stories. If you want epic adventure, the kind of classic, big fantasy that is the hallmark of Dungeons and Dragons, then I would say pick up something like Storm King's Thunder or Tomb of Annihilation, and just plan on running that adventure. Don't plan on running Storm King's Thunder and then that's going to transition into Tomb of Annihilation, because for the most part, those adventures have a lot of overlap where it's like levels 5 to 12, and this is also levels 5 to 14, and you really can't replay that material without doing huge like adaptations and stuff like that. Like, you will literally burn yourself out trying to adjust Tomb of Annihilation so it picks up at level 14 after you've completed Storm King's Thunder. So the good news is you only have to run 2 adventures. You run the starter set, and then you pick out another book, and you plan on running that. And that way you can start reading ahead. You only have 1 book to deal with. You can go back and watch some actual plays from people who have run those adventures and maybe get some ideas of what you would change or make different. Or you can also just go through and start going, okay, let me beat out what I understand the story is, how I might be able to tailor it to be more specific and more personal to the group that I'm developing, and how I might be able to seed some of these elements in, as we talked about earlier, that might then kind of naturally transition them into that next piece of story. Maybe they meet somebody who's searching for the Ring of Winter, or maybe they've heard about the Ring of Winter, and then that leads them to, transition into the Tomb of Annihilation or whatever. So, you don't have to read 15 different books in order to make the world come to life for your players. If you have the starter set, buy one other book and sink your teeth into that. And if you don't feel like there's been enough information, you've soaked up enough information from that book, then it will lead you to read the Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide, or pick up Volo's Guide to Monsters, or whatever. And that will help give you some further inspiration. But start small. I want to say, if you're not starting small, the next book is going to be a big dump of info, but it's only 1 book. And you can cut it into pieces and be okay with, I'm going to ignore this. Especially Storm King's Thunder, and I think all of the books really have developed this sort of if you want to go this way, you could use this path. If you want to go this way, you could use this set of encounters. They try to create a little bit of a branching structure where you can follow this and go, oh great, I can ignore these things. These are not interesting to me. So I ran Storm King's Thunder, so if you want my advice on how I changed it and whatnot, I did a whole season of Disorganized Play. There's literally 50 videos that you can watch of me talking about how it played out and what issues I saw in the adventure and how I would how I reskinned it and remixed it and tidied it up and edited it down in order to get it into a season of Adventurers League. You can't see the actual play for that because I ran it for my local group at the game shop before I really started doing Iron Keep Chronicles, but you can do that. If you want to do Horde of the Dragon Queen, that's cool too. I think there's some tough fights in there, but everything has some encounter where you're like, oh, holy crap. So yeah. The good news is you just have to pick one of those books, and you can start reading that now if you want, as kind of like side reading, and not get too worried about, well, if I put it down for a week or two, it's not going to be a big deal. So, all right. Well, you've watched 10 of those. You've only got 40 to go. Oh! The recaps are tough because I have to, and I end up talking a lot about what happened in the session since you couldn't watch it. So, all right. So we're approaching hour 2 here, and that's about the limit of my vocal cords here today. So I want to thank you all for joining me. If you have any final questions or whatever, I'll bat a little bit of cleanup here, but I would like to bring our time here slowly to a close. It's time for a little snack, and it's time to walk the dog, I think. So those things are going on. Thanks for joining me, everybody. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I enjoy sharing advice and struggles and just talking about the process of running a game, because I think it's a difficult skill set to really master, but I think also there's a common set of problems and patterns and behaviors that we all face and that we all share. And so when somebody brings it up, it's like everybody solves it in a little bit different way, but also everybody struggles with it in their own particular way. And I think it's good to know that it doesn't matter how many years of DMing you have under your belt. There's always room for more insight, and it's also reassuring that guy on that side of the internet, he totally struggles with the same things that I struggle. It's not, you're not a noob, you're not unusual, you're not alone in this is I'm not sure what to do. This is a lot of pressure. How do I tackle this type of thing, right? So that's the buzz. I will have to bring some treats for Luigi on Tuesday, assuming that he is going to come here. Yeah, you can follow me. All my D&D stuff is at Dungeon Bastard on Twitter. I'm happy to take questions there. We do have a Discord also, which I have started participating in. So if you have a question or an issue, I try to check in on that a couple times a week and chime in, and you can always bubble up a question there if you would like. Let's take a look at the calendar. Thank you, Fakwan, for bringing that up. Tonight is our Star Wars Edge of the Empire game with America's GM, David Crennan, and Never Tell Me the Odds. You can catch that tonight at 8 o'clock Pacific. Tomorrow is another intriguing episode of Wild Cards, our Deadlands Savage Worlds game with DJ Jordan Caves Callerman and Megan Caves Callerman and Dom Zook, and Rick Budd is sitting in for Darav Galati, and Jordan Pridgeon will be there as well. So you can tune in on that tomorrow night at 8. Sunday at 5, it's another installment of Tempting Fate with special guests Bonnie Gordon and Xander Generette. So tune in for that. That's always a fun time. They're running a hack of Lasers and Feelings based tailored to the Evil Dead. So check that out on Sunday. It's a fun show. There's a lot of people tuned in for that, so that's cool too. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining me. A great discussion today. I'm really glad we kind of got some time to get into the nuts and bolts of DMing and what those struggles may be. I don't always have the time available to kind of carve out. If I'm at the studio, then I try to keep it a little more tidy because I want to get in the car and beat traffic and get the dog back and all that sort of stuff and get dinner going. And I have my real life obligations to attend to. So it's been fun to have a nice casual conversation and then share some information with you all. Thank you so much to Farquaad and BSB Care and all of our regulars who showed up, and also all of our those people who serve as our mods and help keep the what is the Discord? Let's see if there's a command for that. Discord? No, there's not. Yeah, I used to live within 5 minutes of the studio. BSB Care, don't. Oh no, D20 robot isn't on. I don't think I can start that either. I assume I probably can start it somehow, but I'm not sure what to do about that. Let me see if I can find it. Hang on. Just let me think about. Saving. No, that's not it. Probably by the time I find it, somebody else will. I'm just going to try and see if I can find the link. All right. Where is this thing? That's that. No, I don't have enough. Let's see if I can do a search. Oh, that's in here. Maybe it's in here. Has somebody found it already? Because I'm not there yet. BSB Care found it. Yeah, I'm looking. We have an internal Slack that we use, so that should. Let's see if it works. Ooh, that's not right. Let's see if that gets us in. Yeah, that will get you into the Slack. You may have to do an invite or whatever. How else do I do this? Member list, help. I'm not gonna. I think you can find your way into the Discord if you do it. Yep, very good. All right, cool. So that's the Buzzaloonie. If you want to join the discussion about all of our shows, is there, right? So if you want to talk about wild cards, you want to talk about Tempting Fate, you want to talk about any of the shows that we have on this show. There's a show, actually. There's two shows. There's one for Iron Keep if you want to discuss Iron Keep or view clips or anything like that, or if you want to post to Disorganized Play specifically for GM advice, that's a great place to put. There's a channel specifically for Disorganized Play. In fact, let's double check. There's nothing in there right now. Is there? No, there's not. That's fine. That's just fine. So yeah, you can join our Discord and everything will be cool. All right. So thank you so much. If I had to think, if my Bluetooth speaker hadn't gone to sleep, let me see. You know. What? All right. So, until next time.
Let's dungeon. Let's dungeon. Let's dungeon. Let's dungeon.
I love it.